Hello, and welcome to the Renaissance, Episode 0, The Introduction. The Renaissance is a podcast devoted exclusively to the history of Renaissance art, artists, and the world around them. When I decided to produce an art history podcast, I needed to determine the scope of this topic. Looking at the canon of Western art, do I start with the Egyptians, classical Greece, or Rome, maybe something more contemporary? While I love classical art, I felt the Renaissance would be the perfect place to begin. It is the art movement that has had the most influence on Western art for the past 500 years. And it's the point where we see the artist move from an anonymous artisan to the celebrity artist we are all familiar with today. So what exactly does Renaissance mean? If you were to look the word up in the dictionary, you might find it defined as a rebirth or a renewed interest in something. Of course, when we say the Renaissance, we mean something very specific. The first definition in the Oxford Dictionary is probably the closest. And it says that the Renaissance is a revival of art and literature under the influence of classical models in the 14th through 16th centuries. While Italy was coming out of the Middle Ages, artists, scientists, and philosophers began looking back to their Greek and Roman past. At the same time, wealthy families, such as the Medicis, began filling their homes with ancient Greek and Roman sculptures and manuscripts. With Roman paganism long dead, the church no longer feared these objects as some sort of demonic pagan artifact, but they began to embrace an Aristotelian view, developed during the Middle Ages, that even these ancient sculptures and manuscripts could be used to glorify God and give us a broader glimpse of our humanity. These factors, along with the growing wealth and stability of cities like Florence, allowed for new ideas to flourish. Of course, we must mention the printing press. It allowed for the growth and spread of Renaissance ideas. Johannes Gutenberg's perfection of the movable type printing press around 1440 allowed ideas to spread across Europe at speeds never before seen. Not unlike the tech revolution of the 20th century, the printing press changed how people communicated and the speed at which they did so. No longer were books and classical learning the domain of the wealthy. They were the only ones who could afford these things prior, but less expensive books printed on a printing press allowed all social classes to have access to the works of Greek and Roman antiquity. This partly helps to explain the huge changes taking place in Europe during the 15th century, as we see Europe transform from an illiterate agrarian society to a literate one. I won't say much more about the development of the printing press because it lies beyond the scope of this podcast, but just remember Gutenberg's contribution had a profound effect on the spread of the Renaissance. There isn't a specific date we can really point to for the beginning of the Renaissance. Some might point to Giotto, painter and architect, others to Brunelleschi and Ghiberti. Brunelleschi was a mathematician and artist who discovered linear perspective. Some areas of Europe, such as England or Germany, were slower to adopt Renaissance ideas, nor can we really point to a specific ending. There were still artists working in a Renaissance style well into the early 17th century, during the dawning of what we now know as the Baroque period. Generally, we consider the Renaissance to be ending around the time of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, along with the numerous religious wars we see in the 17th century. All of these labels are arbitrary and defined by later art historians. Arbitrary, yes, but they're still useful in helping us to understand this period. And while we cannot pin down a specific date and time of May 1st, 1401 at 3 o'clock for the start of the Renaissance, we can look to a specific city, Florence. Florence gave birth to the Renaissance. She nurtured it in its infancy until it finally burst into the cathedrals of Rome, Milan, and then later to the German states, Low Countries, and even England. We will discuss more about why Florence was the epicenter of this explosion in episode 1 next week. Just know that we will be spending a lot of time in Florence once we get there. With that said, episode 1 will focus entirely on the city of Florence and its political and economic structure, and how this contributed to the rise of the Renaissance. Even though I stated that defining a beginning and end to the Renaissance is difficult and somewhat arbitrary, We must define this, or we will never get going. Therefore, we will begin Episode 1 discussing the rise of Florence and its political and economic structure. In Episode 2, we will discuss Giotto, who may be considered either a proto-Renaissance or an early Renaissance artist. Whichever way you fall, he was a very influential figure that changed the game of painting forever. As far as an ending, I had originally decided on ending with the last three Ninja Turtles, yes, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael, but as I've done more research, I feel like this should extend beyond a few years to the Mannerist, and we will end with the Mannerist. This will post to roughly about 1600. There were others who continued beyond 1600 in a Renaissance style, but this is where we really see the beginning of the Baroque period, and Baroque art takes over. So it seems like a proper ending for this podcast. But don't worry, we have a couple hundred years, and many other artists to cover between now and then. Few programming notes. I plan to publish weekly, hopefully every Sunday night, so please subscribe to this podcast feed at therenaissancepodcast.com or through your iTunes account. It is possible that I may miss a few publishing dates due to holidays or vacations, but don't worry, I will return the following week. Also, I'm sure I'm going to botch a pronunciation or two. I only have a rudimentary understanding of Italian, but when I do, please email me so I may correct my errors in the future. Thank you for listening, and with that, let's get this thing started.